Before I start this, I want to share with you my experience of trying to teach this stuff only once before in my life. And it was in Austria, and it was, I think, 2.5 years ago. And I was introducing my long-term European students to the bases of design down to the deepest level. And this was a wonderful group of human beings who were full of excitement and interest and were deep into human design and took everything in. And they were always fun to work with. And then I got to juxtaposition theory, and I got to all of this stuff below the surface of the line, and I had the worst teaching experience I've ever had. Now, if you do this to me today, I'm going to be really pissed. Okay? So save me the grief. I want you to really recognize that it's practically impossible. It's practically impossible for any of us, and that includes myself and anybody else, for any of us to really be in touch with what I'm going to describe to you over this next couple of days. And what I mean by that is not the intellectual grasping of it, because that we'll be able to do. That's our process together. But to actually be able to feel that in you, that's something else. What I will do for you, and you'll have to, Suzanne, maybe you can do that. You can organize a sheet of paper. If all of you give me either your birth data or the exact position of your personality sun, tomorrow when I come in, I will give you, according to that, what you've given me, I will give you your colors and tones and bases. In other words, I will give you the exact calculations so that you can have that for yourself. Now, in doing that, please recognize that it's a dangerous thing to take this information in deeply if you're not comfortable with your time. If you're comfortable with your time within 4 minutes, then you can be assured that you're getting the right color. Now, the color is very important because, as you'll see when we get there in May, you know, this is the deep underlying motivation of everything we do. So we get access to that. If you have time that's accurate to within the minute, you will get the tone. You'll get the tone. So remember, you've got to have good time. And if you have time that you know is plus or minus 15 seconds, you can get the base. So, you know, keep that in mind as you're giving me this information, and recognize that most of you, that is, you know, I can't be terribly specific here, but most of you will be accurate to the color level. And of course, that is something that will be significant for you. In the case, for example, of my children, where I had a designated timekeeper, so that there was accurate time to the second, and that is BBC time to the second, it's possible to be very certain about bases. But for example, even in my time, which is plus or minus a minute, plus or minus a minute, I cannot be certain of my base. And when I actually do my base calculation based on the time that I have, which is incredibly accurate because I was cesarean, and they really, you know, my mother made a point of all of that, so we knew, I come up with a base that is not the base the voice told me I have, which is the next one, which means that my time variation would change by about 11 or 12 seconds. So, you know, the level of accuracy that you need is really quite remarkable. Remember, this is for a very different time. The other thing is just a note. Most of us, in any kind of connection with the, you know, the daily processing that goes on in the world and the news and all of these things, since the late 1950s, we've had nothing but population predictions that say that we're going to have, you know, 20 billion and 25 billion and all of these things. And this has been going on now for the last 40 years, that we have had this continual input of this information about population expansion. The other day was Earth Day. And I had CNN on, and they were interviewing one of the directors of whatever it is, one of these big Earth blah, blah, blah things. And they asked him if there was any good news for the Earth. And he said, yes, there is. He says, surprisingly enough, it looks like we're going to have a population peak in this century. He says, infertility is on the rise. It's epidemic. It looks like we're going to peak at 8 billion by 2050. And then we're going to be decreasing. Now, of course, for him, that was good news. It meant more resources, that we weren't going to eat up the earth and whatever. But, that's the first time in my lifetime that I've ever heard anybody in one of those positions where they put out that kind of information talk about what I've been telling people for years, is that we're going to have an amazing crash in the human population. It's something that's actually coming. Okay. That was the news.
We're cheering.
Yeah, good. Okay. Let's go from the mundane to the really mundane. In the discussions that I had with you when I was introducing the theory of the neutrino biverse, we saw the way in which at the mechanical level in the biverse, that at that side of the duality in the biverse, that what we have is that we have 5 different dimensional fields that are at work. Now, you have to see that we have a real difference between the way in which we interact with the 2 different aspects of the biverse, that is the Einstein field of light and the mechanical environment. In the Einstein field of light, we interact with it, but the mechanical aspect is within us. In other words, we actually carry it, we actually make it happen. In other words, we are aspects of the very dimensional forces themselves, and each of us carry aspects of those dimensional forces at the base level, in what we call a base level in the calculation and design. In other words, when you come in, you come in and you have a specific base. Now, please recognize something about the nature of the personality crystal, is that the personality crystal cannot change bases. It's not baseball. That personality crystal comes in with a base from the beginning. Now, whatever you want to call the beginning, we can call the beginning the Big Bang. In other words, when the crystal shattered at the Big Bang, all of those crystals in their shattering, each of them have one pole in that sense, or one facet in that sense, in which they are going to be fixed in forever. I mean, forever. It isn't going to change. So think about yourself in terms of the way you incarnate. You can have different tones. You can have different colors. You can have different lines. You can have different gaits. You can have totally different definition. You can have all kinds of things, but you're always going to have the same base. If you're looking for continuity in what we call incarnation, the continuity in the incarnation is the fixed base of the personality. In the end, it's why it's so interesting to find out what your base is. Because you see, this has been your line in the geometry since the very beginning, your perception in the geometry since the very beginning. Because of that very concrete isolation, each of us carrying it within ourselves, each of us have a continuity of maintaining the dimensional field. So if you're somebody that comes in and you have a first base or whatever the case may be, you actually are a part of creating that mechanical environment. It's one of the jokes. In other words, we are the dimensional force, literally the dimensional force. It is within us. So when I describe these bases, what I'm actually going to be describing for you is how the macrocosmic way in which the dimensional field operates gets concretized in you, and gets concretized in you in the way in which you operate and in the way in which you're limited ultimately in your perspective. See, I'm an Aries with the sun in 51. I've always known that I'm a fool. Always. I can only have one of those 5 aspects. I have a perspective. I have that perspective that's limited by my base, but the totality is greater than me. Always. All I've got is that line that I'm going to follow down, and that says to me, that other stuff, I don't know, it's not my business. Here's that line and I can't see any other thing. That's why you see we have this sense of importance. I'm always astonished at human beings and their sense of importance. Vanity's a brutal creature, rips people apart. It's the first thing I learned when I started off as a black magician. It's the first thing you learn. The vein. You never have to worry about the vein because the vein get crushed. It's just the way that it works. You don't have to do anything. And then they blame you. You did that to me. Yeah. No. Vanity does that to you. Right? Everything about taking anybody to this level of knowledge is about stripping away the vanity of any of this being personal. Any of us being bigger than what the truth shows us. Which is that, it's all very nice. We all have our illusions, but we're all pieces in the huge, huge matrix of what life is. And of course, at this level, when you get down to this level, you really get down to seeing, okay, I'm really not going to take any of this seriously anymore because it isn't going to do me any good. I've got my little line over here. Terrific. If you live your line, you do your job for the totality, and that in the end is what it's about. Okay. So we're going to begin, and I'm going to take you through the 5 bases, and where we're going to start with is that these keynotes are there as a guide. And out of these keynotes, we will have the framework in which we can look at these individual bases. And that in order to guide you through this, when you're looking at this, please understand that this first base is actually called reactive. The measurement above that, as you'll see, this is a general thematic, but just so that you get it straight, the first base is called reactive. Now, in looking at this, first of all, and I'll come back to this graph so you can write all this stuff down. When you come over here we have the macrocosmic, that is the way the dimensional field operates, and over here we have the microcosmic, the way that it operates in humanity generally. And one of the things to see about this is that this is a very, very primary field, that the first base is yang, and that this first base being yang, this is all about movement, this is all about energy. So what we have in the beginning here is that we have a yang force. Hold on while I get myself organized. Okay, so first of all, we start off with this general theme of measurement. It's one of the oldest of the number games. It's the whole business about the difference between 1 and 2. The difference between 1 and 2 can only be movement. There is nothing else. There has to be this movement. And you see, this is the first thing that is the breath, if you will, of life. It's why we've got a heavy trip with trying to make God yang. We've got this trip with making God yang because there is this quality of the breath of life that is there in the pure energy, the pure yang energy. After all, it is that pure yang energy, in fact, that is moving towards the design crystal. I mean, you have to think about that. In other words, in the very beginning of the Big Bang, in a sense, it is the yang that banged into the yin. In other words, that energy, that breath, that is an initiating force. That initiating force is what, in the end, within us, creates what we call individuality, because individuality is a byproduct of this movement, and the movement leads in us to what we call measurement. The beginning, in a sense, is Maya. After all, that's what Maya means in the Sanskrit. Ma, or the root of Maya, ma, means to measure. And so what we have here is that we have the first ingredient of life, but it tells you a lot about what a first base person is always going to be about. What they're always going to be about is, where am I? You see, look, if there's no separation, and that's what movement creates, if there's no separation, there's no Maya. I mean, think about the guy or the woman that's sitting in a cave. They've never seen a human being. They don't know anything about the outside world. Nothing whatsoever. They're simply there inside of the cave. And inside of that cave, they can always say, I am. I mean, it's so easy because there's nothing else. I mean, if you look at the greatest thinkers and they probe as deep as they can, they only can get to I am. I am is totally alone. That's totally alone. That's totally correct. However, the moment that I am is confronted with light, is confronted with another, then it's not enough to be I am. I am what? Compared to what? I am not you. I am different. All of these measurements begin to take place, and it's through these measurements that we define the Maya that's around us. In other words, the great catch-22 is that Maya creates Maya. Isn't that nice? We never have a chance, eh? I mean, the illusion just creates another illusion, and then we all get caught up in it, and we think, oh, this is us. But this is the beginning. The beginning is, think about that. Look, it's the joke, eh? The whole spiritual world wants to be one. I mean, they don't know they are one, which to me seems the height of ignorance. However, they all want to be one. But what do you get as a first base? The first base says, hey, excuse me, we can't be one. We have to be separate so that we can measure. We don't have a choice. This business about wanting to be one, this is just a yearning to be aware. We're already one. No question about that. So when you're dealing with this first reactive base, you're dealing with, try to see that as I talk about it, try to see that within a person and how that operates. Remember, we're talking about the foundation of their perspective in life. We're talking about the very base of what they are going to be and operate out of. It doesn't matter what's sitting at the top. It has to come down, gate to line, to color, to tone, to base, because the base is the foundation. You see, the way a real calculation is done is from the base up. It's not from the hexagram down to the line, which is the way we do calculations. It's from the base up. Because that sets the platform. And no matter what gate or line this being's going to have that has the first line base in their personality, that that everything and every way they operate is going to be touched with this need to measure, this need to separate, this need to see where everything is. They're different. And we'll see that there are groupings of these human beings. Remember that. Each of these bases, they're locking us into archetypal foundations, which are, in fact, dimensional fields operating as us, through us. I mean, after all, if it weren't for human beings, there wouldn't be a universe. I mean, we make it up every day. I mean, we do. We make up the measurement. We say it's 3,000 light years away. I love that. Yeah, sure. Okay, so you say. It's so funny to me. Anyway, okay, so look. The whole theme is measurement. So one of the things that you have to see is that at the very, very foundation of life, I want to tell you something about being a first base being, is that being a first base being, you're actually very far away from being human. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you're related to apes or... Did you like that? Let's do the Scopes trial with a new kind of approach, eh? Only one base is specifically about being human. We'll get there. All of these bases are involved not just simply in our life process, but in all living processes. And you see that every form of life needs to measure, and without measurement it will not survive. You know, the flower that turns to the sun. You know, all of these things that are there in nature are inherent. It's not just saying, that's why it's so difficult to just touch this. Because it's not just human. It's life. And the fundamental aspect, the first base, the foundation of all life in the mechanical sense, that foundation is we better be separate from each other in order to measure each other, because that's how we stay alive. I mean, that's how they stay alive. Not only that, by being separate, they can make more. And they can keep more and more alive. And more separate. And more definitions. I mean, look at it. The keynote under uniqueness here is I define. And the things that we can define now, it's unbelievable what we can define. The minutiae of what we can define in every possible category. Hell, there are people who define things that don't even exist. They make them up just to define them. It's the way things work. It's a first base theme. You see, and it's the basis of life. So one of the things that you're going to notice about how that operates in a human being, because it is the deepest foundation, is that it can, you know, like all things, and remember that's dualistic in nature, it represents a limitation. They're not going to feel fulfilled until they can be successful in measuring. These are people that their whole life is going to be about that. How they measure themselves against this or that or whatever. And it's not like, as a psychologist, you can deal with that, because that is not a level they're working with. It's a restriction and a construct within their design. You can't help them with that in that sense. What you can do is show them that that is the correct limitation. In other words, yes, it is right for them to measure everything. You know, it is right for them to always be the one who's trying to define through the separation what things are, what they could be, might be, should be. Because you have no access. You can't go down there. And remember, it's not just going to be impacting on one aspect of your nature. This is the base, and that base of the personality, that base that you have, that colors everything in your nature. It colors your whole purpose and the whole reason why you're here. And remember, you always have the same base. Time after time after time after time. I mean, after all, after 18 or 12 or 15 billion years, however old this universe is, you know, we've really got experience with those perspectives. I mean, we do, after all. You know, it's one of the most incredible things for me is that when you get down to this level in the mathematics, and like everything else in design, the mathematics are not only perfect, but they're beautiful to watch. You get to see the magic of it, because you see, out of these tiny little bases, they open up into broader and broader and broader and broader and broader fields. What we use as a general tool to wake people up, which is only a matter of type and profile and authority and definition, the basic things of design. You know, that's a very, very different field than what this is all about. You know, you're talking here that when you look up there to that gate, you know, that gate's huge and wide compared to that very, very, very tiny little space you get to when you get down to the base that's really that being. And in seeing that, you can see that if you don't see the base, you don't get to see how everything else operates. because everything else is rooted in it. It's the same thing with tone. I mean, tone's more amusing because in tone you get to see what departments you work for. You get to see where your labors are, to benefit the whole. But even there, it's not like you get access to it. People get access to the tone level through drugs or mystical experiences. That is something that is possible. You have a Satori, and you get to the tone level, and you suddenly feel like, you've met an angel, you've been in heaven, you talk to the demons, whatever the case may be. A door opens up there because that's the tone level. That's actually inside of us. Because that's the place where most people think heaven is, which is kind of cute, Wow, heaven, it's down. Whoa, it's down. No, that's not true. Can't be. It's deep within us. So here at the base level, we're really helpless in that. So when you get to see that, then you get to see how everything is moving outward from it. All right. What comes out of the first stage of looking at this reactive base is to see the facet. Now, these facets, it's not that I'm giving a name to the facet because the name of the facet is already reactive. Think about it this way. Imagine that every crystal is a crystal that has 5 faces. Just 5 faces. So each of those faces are called a facet. And one of the things to be clear about that facet is that of each of those 5 facets, each base represents one facet. So this description here under facet that says individuality, movement, these are the keynotes for this facet of being reactive. In other words, the reactive facet, the keynotes are individuality and movement. The longer I'm around and the more I get to think, the more respect I have for Charles Darwin. The concepts of survival of the fittest and the way in which the genetic pool tries to protect itself. These are things that are very, very important. This separation wasn't about being limited by being designed to be separate. It was about the hope of and the power of potential mutation. You see, that's one of the things about population. The more you expand the population, the more likely you're going to have mutative potential within that population. And you see, in order for the expansion of consciousness to develop, life had to separate. Not just you and I from each other, but every blade of grass from each other. You see, it's in that separation, it's in that interactive separation that we grow. This whole definition business is a growth process of awareness and consciousness. And it's what we were designed to have from the beginning, this constant separation in order to be able to define individuality. But something else. You see, movement. This is one of the deepest underlying themes that we live out. It's at the basis of life itself. Keep on moving. Humanity really has a problem right now. And one of its major problems is it's not financially acceptable to go to war at any major level. It's not possible to discover new territories. Humanity has a hard time trying to deal with having no place to go. What we've replaced it with is what we call modern tourism. In other words, we have 10 or 12 billion passengers a year, which is much more than our population, that are moving around. There's this tremendous need in humanity to move because after all, it's like the parents saying, yes, I'm going to send my teenager to Europe because it will be culturally enriching, or in older language, let's go into the next valley and sack them and see if the women are better. That movement is going to bring expansion, education. It's going to bring new definition. They are different. They look like this. They talk like that. And all of that expands our consciousness. Right from the beginning. You know, there's something like, I don't know what the number is, 1.5 million different subspecies of beetle. I mean, wow. Hey? I mean, talk about a genetic trip. Wow. Because that's what it's all about. That's life. That's life, teeming with life. Every once in a while, I get to see these wonderful clips of cities like New York or London at night, high speed, 3 hours compressed into 4 minutes. And you get this whoosh, 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 whoosh. This is the first base. This is where we start, moving and moving and moving. It's everything. You see, it's only when you get later into different bases that you get to a point where people start saying, well, is there anything else? You know, this is not human. This is life. This is just life. And of course, you can see that no matter what happens to you at the level of living out your rave, you know, whatever your mundane life happens to be, you know, that you're going to be driven from the beginning, underneath, to run around and measure things, you know, and it doesn't matter whether you're measuring the carpet or, you know, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You're out there underneath measuring it. And, you know, somebody will say to you, you know, I've watched you for years and, you know, you're really into this measuring trip. And, you know, they're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. It's your base. You can't be taken down there. I have friends of mine in Europe who have been professional hypnotists, therapeutic hypnotists, for some of them for over 2 decades, and who held several experiments in trying to get people down to the base level. They couldn't. They get some people to tone. As I said, tone can be achieved through certain kinds of experiences so that you can actually sense that. But the base level, there is no way for us. And of course, that's one of the things to see, is that because it marks everything in the design, it gets diffused through the design as well. How you measure with your mind is different than how you're going to measure, you know, with your touch or with, you know, there's different ways in which it can operate. But nonetheless, it's there underneath the surface. And so is the movement, because the quality of this facet, the quality is activity. Now think about what that looks like. Imagine you've got a first base and you're a 2034. Eh? You know? A wind-up doll that has an atomic engine. You know? Wah, zoom. They're gone. You never see them again. They burn holes in the ground. You know what to do. You see, being busy is life. I mean, after all, it's only human beings who rationalize all this shit. You know, well, I have to go do this today because, you know, when the fact is that from the moment we come into the world, we're scratching and kicking and moving our arms and jumping up and down. And, you know, we never stop. Because busy is life. Nothing more terrifying for a parent to look at your child, young child, and it doesn't look like anything's moving. You know, it's instantaneously terrifying, even though it's an absurd fear, eh? Because, you know, activity means everything to us. Everything. It's the base of what it is to be in the world, and to be alive is busy and moving. Obviously, when you bring this into somebody's design, that you can see that we end up diagnosing many of these people as being compulsives. And of course, depending on the basic design that they have, wherever their inherent weakness is in terms of the open centers, whether they're open emotionally or mentally, whatever the case may be, that you can see how all of this driving activity at underneath that they have no access to can be very difficult for them. You can't take a first base person and say to them, look, I want you to lie here real still, you know, and I want you to lie here real still and relax because you need to rest, you know. I mean, they can't do that. That's not life. It's not life. Life is you're busy till you go to sleep. That's all. That's life. So this is very primal in that sense. But, you know, it speaks of the mystery for me, the deep mystery of what life is, and how funny we are in the way in which we label these things. You know, it comes back to my old bugaboo about making up reasons. I hear reasons all the time. I hear people constantly trying to make up a reason for this or that or whatever the case may be. It's hilarious, after all. I mean, it really is. And when you get down to the base level and you see that we have deep, deep factors at work that actually determine and limit the way in which we're going to operate as a whole, we have no access to it. We're not here to be tuned to it. I mean, get rid of your vanity. Get rid of any sense that, you're going to be in charge of anything. And at the same time to see that by, again, allowing that to happen, allowing yourself to be yourself. You see, if you happen to be somebody that has a first base and you're operating out of your type, you're operating out of your strategy, it's going to be okay. After all, this is an extraordinary time for me. The fact that we have begun successfully to be able to see statistically and to see scientifically the validity of design and its matrices. That we can see now that type is something that is a legitimate construct, that it exists in any population. It's a beginning of an opportunity to recognize a very, very basic and simple thing. I tell you this a lot because many of you have been in my life now for many years. And so you hear it over and over again. All of this detail is because human design is a science. This is a science. It's not a pseudoscience. It's a real science. And as a real science, all of these things need to be covered. I have no personal interest in teaching you this stuff. Please understand that. I really don't, because it's of no particular value in that sense. For me, the whole process is that I'm an Aries, and I'm a rat, and I'm a seed planter, and I'm a messenger. I care about people knowing about design and knowing the basic strategies of design so that they can be healed in their life. That's my concern. But it is a science, and as a science, all of these things need to be said, they need to be recorded, they need to be stored, they need to be researched, all of those things. So that's my purpose in this, and sharing this with you. But it's an essential thing to see that regardless of what your base is, because you can end up, because we are binaries and we are moralistic at our core, you end up saying, gee, I don't want to be one of those. I hope that's not my base. And for many of you, it's going to be really nice because you don't have perfect time, and because of that, you can always protect yourself. No, I'm not a first base at all. I know that. No, I'm a fourth base. No, it's 28 seconds later. So leave all that aside. It's about the science of this, and I want you to appreciate and enjoy the science of that. If there's something in that you really do attune to, okay, that's fine. But it's not to see that this has, general application, because it doesn't. It has scientific application. This knowledge is incredibly important. One of the reasons why this recording process that we're going through, New Sun Services continues to record and expand the library of my teachings in human design. Yet at the same time, all of this information, the bases, the tones, the colors, the crosses, all of this information is being transcribed and is eventually going to be, we're hoping within a year and a half now, it will eventually be together in a Global Incarnation Index program, in which you will be able to go in there and to get all of this information on your particular calculation. So one of the sidebars of this in terms of sharing this knowledge with you is to be able to make it generally available to people so that everybody can get access to information about their base, their tone, in accurate calculations. This whole business about the quality of this space and the quality of activity, please recognize what activity actually leads to. What it really leads to is uniqueness. And uniqueness, of course, is one of my favorite mantras. You are unique. You have no choice. Love yourself. Uniqueness is an extraordinary thing because it is life. We are unique. We are truly unique. And when you can see how finite these calculations are, you can see how different we are. I have had so many twins come to me. And usually you don't even have to get further than the color to get the difference between them. The fact of the matter is that we are unique, and we have always carried, as incarnating forces, we have always carried the same unique perspective, the same unique facet from the beginning. Many of you know that in some of the Grey courses I've talked about fractals. In other words, I've talked about the way in which crystals align with each other. And one of the things to see very clearly is that everybody has a fractal alignment. Everybody has a fractal alignment to 4 other forces. Everybody. That's an immediate fractal. Everybody. In other words, you have one facet. So you automatically, out of that one facet, have a fractal connection to the other 4 aspects of that facet. And through them, the fractal line can grow outward, because that's the way that it works. The uniqueness does not mean that we are necessarily different, and it's one of the deepest confusions that humans have. Uniqueness and difference are not the same. You know how many teenagers have gone through that process of thinking nobody else suffers what they're suffering, knows what they're going through, because it's a common experience in human beings. Because we are separate and we are unique, there is this sense that nobody else is like us. Well, we know that's not true. 70% of the planet are generators. They're very much alike, but they are still unique. And that there are ranges of differences between us, but there's also commonality between us, which is what the fractal brings. In other words, that it's not simply about finding your own uniqueness at the expense of others. It's finding your own uniqueness and recognizing the uniqueness in others. You see, otherwise there's no growth. Otherwise there is no continued development. Otherwise there's no opportunity for Darwinian evolutionary jumps. See, what's going to happen is that when the population crashes, mutation becomes less and less likely. Think about that. You go into a period of stasis. The last time we had that, we called it the Dark Ages. When the Roman Empire fell, there was all kinds of bloodletting and killing, and the population went down radically, and basic services disappeared. A lot of people starved in the first 100 years or so. And at the moment that you had that population crash, what did you have after that? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to redevelop. Because you don't have the same mutative opportunities. You don't have the same 1 in a million chance that you're going to get that genius that's going to change that aspect of the way in which the totality functions. After all, the fact that we have this enormous population with so many different genetic combinations is that we're at the peak of our brilliance. We're at the peak of our mutative brilliance. Everywhere you look on this planet, the brilliance is popping everywhere. It's incredible. But that's the result of having this huge, vast pool, and the price of that is 3 billion people going to bed hungry at night. Because that's the price of that expansion. Yet at the same time, it is about understanding that this expansion and separation ultimately creates the density necessary out of which mutation operates, out of which we do get those moments of spark and genius that transform the species. So all of this activity is great stuff. Because you see, by being busy and by being active, they're always out there ready for that moment of transition. And that's what life is about. You know how many thousands of years we picked damn berries? You know how many thousands of years we ate flesh cold? Until somebody dropped it in the fire and said, gee, this is the way things work. Now we live in a much speeded up environment. You see, our civilization gets in the way. I had that experience yesterday because Chaitanya and I were recording the neutrino forecast for 2001. And you watch the way in which, this program is operating. You see the way in which it impinges on everyone. It's a fascinating thing to watch. And what it brings into all of that is that it brings in this deep reinforcement of this difference between this uniqueness and difference. Everybody's in the same program. Everybody's getting the same thing going on to them, because this is the dichotomy that we're always living in. And it's out of that that we get this expansion. In the neutrino forecast, there are all these different points in the calendar. And all these different points in the calendar, they're historical moments. They've always been there in the program to get us to do certain things. So there's certain months, for example, where we're designed to be very sexual. Now that goes back tens of thousands of years. And we have difficulty in dealing with it now in our modern civilization because we've forgotten the festivals, the Bacchanalian rite or whatever that was that actually fulfilled that timing, fulfilled that program. It's gone. So much of what we have forgotten is how fast we have moved intellectually. Our civilization may be really quite sophisticated, yet, it's so thin, all of that. It's thin. Underneath, we're still being driven by all of these forces. And I know when that month comes in this year or next year, that there's going to be tens of thousands of people that end up getting into trouble sexually in that month, instead of celebrating, getting drunk and having a good time. And all of that being sanctioned by somebody's God. So it's very important to see that when we're looking at something as basic here as what is the first base, it is the primary facet and perspective. To recognize it's always there, regardless of what the patina of your civilization or your costume happens to be, that it's always there. And that it is the nature of life itself. And stop moaning about not feeling like you're one. Give me a break. It doesn't matter whether you feel it. You are. You just are. And it's never going to matter whether you feel it or not, because some people will and some people won't, and some people will get it and other people won't. Because it's just the way that it is. See, and that's what we're taught at the base level. We're making it all happen. Life makes life happen. It's the same conundrum as Maya creating Maya. It's the same story as the chicken and the egg. You see, we are keeping the biverse alive. Life keeps life alive. It's the way it's always been. It's the way it will always be. So being busy, being active, being separate, being somebody who says, hey, you're black, you're white, you're green, you're yellow, you're this, you're that, what to do. That's basic. All of that defining, all of that movement, all of that activity, all of that stuff. Go forth and multiply. Be busy. Be busy, make more. Wait for those moments of mutation. Everything's going to be terrific. That's the program. Let's talk about uniqueness for a moment and talk about you'll see that in each of these bases, there's a quotation there and a quotation there that is phrased in terms of I. And in this case, I define. There is no fulfillment for us in consciousness until we have defined everything definable that's useful to us and needs to be defined. In other words, all of that activity in the end is so that we can expand the definition of everything in order to grasp the essence of all things. That's what the synthesis of human design is about. It is about finally being able to get to a point where all the essential ingredients of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be in life, what it is to be in the larger life, that all of that is accessible to us and not accessible to us as philosophy, not accessible as something in which we have to believe in it in order to make it happen in that sense, but something that can be concretized and is logical for us. Again, the importance of acknowledging what the 15.5 is as a channel in design, and to recognize how significant it is that all forms of life, not only must they operate through a pattern in order to be in the flow, and that's the generation of the life force itself, but that because we are here to define, ultimately we have to be able to define all of those patterns. And we're getting very, 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 very good at it, after all. We're getting to the point that we're so good at defining the patterns that we're beginning to be able to create life. I know there's a lot of people who are upset with such things. You know, the cloning of sheep and pigs and stuff. And ultimately, or at least right now, who knows, somewhere on the planet, the cloning of a human being. Again, I come from a stance that is not moralistic and is purely mechanical. For me, it is obvious that it is the destiny of our species to be able to recreate our species. It's the destiny of our species to be able to manipulate life. Obviously, it is what we are doing because it's the net result of being able to define things. If you can define them, you can mess with them. You can play with them. You can try to alter them and all of these things. It's part of our intellectual growth. And remember that the whole purpose of life is to ultimately be conscious and aware. And you have to go through this stage of defining. And think about something else when the change comes. You know, when the great cosmic wind comes and strips away these costumes that we have and gives us another set of costumes, we're still going to have the same 5-faceted crystals. You know, it's still going to be there. Oh yeah, it's got to operate out of a different costume. You know, it's going to get a brand new set of wheels, so to speak. But the fact of the matter is that none of those facets are going to disappear. They've been there from the beginning. They're going to be there to the end. And I'll tell you something else. They're going to be there in whatever it is that's beyond the end, that starts something else that will begin someplace else. It's an ongoing process. You're not going to get rid of this, and this is at the basis of what it is to be alive. And you see, look, if you can accept, intellectually to begin with, if you can accept that this is the basis to be alive, that is, that we are here to be separate, then you can stop bitching about being alone. You know? Because it's true. Stop bitching. We're always alone. All of us. We're always alone. Doesn't matter who we love. It doesn't matter who we know. It doesn't matter who we care about. We're alone in here. That's what the first base says. We're alone in here. Now, that's okay. It's not about being lonely in here. But we are alone. And you see, so many human beings are struggling against that aloneness. Now, part of that aloneness, part of being alone, and the struggle of being alone is built into this. You know, and out of this we have the dynamic that ultimately ends up being what we call sex. You know, it comes with the need of needing to bond. I mean, isn't it interesting the way our equipment works, that we actually look like we're one when we bond? You know? You know, we just hook up that way. You know, because it's a sense of, wow, we're one. Yeah. Inside, you're alone. Doesn't matter how good it is. You're still alone inside. You're always going to be alone inside. It's how it starts. And you see, we have to honor that. We have to honor that, you know, it's where I start with loving yourself. You're alone. You know, you have to love yourself. You. It's not about the others. It's not. It never can be. Oh, love is a wonderful thing to share. There's no question about that. But it's love as we experience it on the mundane plane within the context of our designs and the way that we work. And I'm talking about something much deeper in all that. See, when you get down to this level, there's no human philosophical, intellectual stuff. There isn't. There's just that I'm here alone. I'm different from all of them, and I better watch my P's and Q's or I won't survive. And you see, that's one way in which we live things out. Now think about something else, and I want you to, those of you that weren't here at the Biverse course, I gave out an example of my chart done as a complete chart right down to the base level. And when you look at a chart like that, you don't simply see the profile. In other words, you don't simply see the Sun-Earth configurations and what the base happens to be. Obviously, every calculation goes down to a base. I mean, every calculation goes down to a base. Now, it's not those bases that are determining your purpose and your movement in space, because that comes from your personality and only your personality. But it's also saying that within you, you're going to have access to, in that sense, these other dimensional fields. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. In other words, otherwise, we would have simply 5 different divisions out here on the planet with no interaction between any of them. We have within us all of these different aspects of the dimensional field in order to be able to stay and live within the dimensional field. So look, you may not have a first-line base, but it doesn't mean that you're not in tune to that. Otherwise, you could not be part of this living process. Remember, it maintains the dimensional field. It's not like you're isolated from any of this energy at all. But in terms of your purpose, in terms of what so many people who are mystical in a sense, or spiritual in a sense, are interested in, that is the nature of the transcendent personality crystal, or the soul, or whatever name you want to give to that, to recognize that, again, it's always going to be carrying the same base, but it does need to be able to integrate with everything else around it. By the way, most of the integration is done through the earth in that sense. And the base that comes with, sorry, not the earth, the base that comes with the design side, with the design sun and earth. In these courses, I don't have an opportunity to talk to you about interpretation of such things. And that beginning in September, I will make available readings at different levels, depending on how reliable people think their timing is, so that you can get a taste of what the analytical value is of knowing a color or knowing a tone, for that matter, what one would say by knowing somebody's base. Remember, all of you who work professionally at some point or another, because you're going to be dealing with people of our generation who are much more conscious of keeping the time of the birth of their children, you're going to have opportunities to be able to look at very deep levels of people's designs, some of them right down to the base level. So it's important to see that there's different ways in which this works. I'm only describing to you the personality crystal and the way the personality crystal operates through the personality in that configuration, what that base is going to be in terms of where your personality sun is. The Global Incarnation Index does not operate according to gate and line. It can't. After all, that's much too generalized. So the Incarnation Index operates at the exact astrological position of the sun at birth down to 1,000th of a second. I mean, that's how far we can go in the actual program itself in measurement, so that we can go down to very, very detailed measurement. The physical measurement we use is 100th of a second. In other words, we can go down to 100th of a second of arc. So you can get very, very, very accurate calculations down at that level. Where this leads to is that it leads to the next 3 keynotes, and these next 3 keynotes, they're very significant. You're going to see there's a repetition of this, and it's going to give you some kind of hint of where the base actually brings you to when it finally gets to the surface of your life, in that sense. In other words, these are much more oriented to the way in which an individual is going to not so much experience the base, but have the base impact on them. And the first one I want to look at is the one in the middle, and the one in the middle is seeing. Now, the first thing that you're going to notice is that each of the bases is connected specifically to a sense. And of course, that becomes very significant. In other words, you will see that where the base is focused on a particular sense, that sense is going to be the heightened instrument through which the various aspects will operate in the whole design. In other words, for example, somebody with seeing, that at the human level, that the visual, that is the visual context, is going to be the dominant theme for them. You know, considering that this is all about movement and measurement, they need to see it. I mean, they need to see it. They need to really see it. They need to see how it works. You know, they need to see the details. They need to see all of these things. This is life. Now, of course, if you go down to more simple forms of life, the first thing that you can see in terms of dealing with this general term of seeing is that you're really dealing with the response to or the recognition of light. It's all about light. And it's all about the response to light. Remember, this is a yang facet. And as a yang facet, the light is a big deal. I mean, after all, the Maya is wrapped in light. It's a big deal. So the seeing that we have at the human level, that's the way that we live out the impact of this facet. But it also means something very basic about what we understand as human life. That is, one of the first things making us different is the way in which our vision operates. Now, if you look around, for example, in the animal world, in the mammalian world, you're not going to find this way in which the eyes have been brought together into the front of the head. It's something that's actually quite unusual. And we have a very specific kind and very important kind of vision. The other thing is we have a color mutation. I always try to remember his name, and I never remember his name, and I really like what he does. The guy that wrote the book, The Man Who Thought His Wife Was a Hat? Sacks. Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks. There's this extraordinary. Oliver Sacks is a neuro something or other, and he does tremendous amount of investigation into what happens to people with unusual accidents or experiences in the brain in order to try to understand various places in the brain and how they operate. And this is a delightful, my sense of humor. This is an extraordinary story. There's a guy driving in his car. He's an artist, and he's a very successful graphic artist in New York. And he's driving in his car, and he has a heart attack, a stroke. And in having that stroke, you know, his car bangs into something, he loses consciousness, whatever the case may be, blah, blah, blah. He wakes up, whatever, in the hospital, and he doesn't see in color anymore. All his color vision is gone. What he is seeing is everything is in different shades of gray. Everything. I mean, he's a graphic artist after all. And everything is just in these weird shades of gray. He found, for example, that at night he could see tremendous distances, you know, and see things with certain clarity. But he's an artist after all. There were no colors. And what was interesting was, you know, if he stopped painting, he lost his living. And of course, he had a palette. And he knew from being an artist for many, many years, you know, what colors were in the palette, and he tried to continue his work as an artist, and of course it didn't work. I mean, at first people thought it was really bizarre, because it seems all right, but you know there's no color sense, and then he started to paint what he could see. Now, what they found in all of that is something really incredible. You know, what they found is 9 molecules that permit us to see in color. 9 molecules. You know, this is really tiny stuff compared to the mass of what we are. It's those 9 little molecules that are in control of our color vision. And he had a stroke, the blood was cut off from those molecules, and of course they were damaged, and it changed his vision. I love that stuff, you know. Incredible the way in which this mechanism operates. So seeing, not only is seeing something incredibly sophisticated in the way in which we operate through seeing, but the other thing is that the moment that seeing becomes dominant, that's the moment that everything else is secondary. And everything else is secondary to the light from the beginning. Everything. You know, that's why we end up with all of these philosophies that the light is great and the light has all of this and blah, blah, blah. On and on and on and on and on and on. You know, because it's built into the construct of the Maya from the very beginning. It's built into the foundation of what the dimensional field is. That dimensional field is, you know, that we are attuned to the light and that vision becomes everything for us in that sense. And it's out of the vision that everything is marked. You know, that's the way in which we define everything. And of course, that's where the next illusion comes in, because the way in which we see is relative. You know, the bumblebee going towards the flower sees a different flower than what we see. You know, it's different. It's totally different. They're operating at another wavelength. I mean, there is this illusion of the way in which vision works, but seeing is everything to these people. So one of the things you're going to notice about first-base people is that they're going to be like the man from Missouri. They're going to say, show me. Show me. You know, these are not people that are going to be believers. As a matter of fact, it can make them quite uncomfortable because they can be so busy with what they think is right that they may not see what isn't. But nonetheless, whatever the case may be, the fact is that, you know, this is the main activity here. The main activity is seeing, is watching, is looking. Just about everything at the sexual level in humanity would disappear if it weren't for our eyeballs. I mean, after all, that's the sexiest part of a human being, isn't it? It's not about sexy in the sense of looking at them or seeing them. You can make something out of eyes if you like. It's just what the eyes do. You know, it's the eyes that are looking. It's the eyes that create the configuration. It's the eyes that have the illusion. It's the eyes that can take your clothes off. It's the eyes that do all of that. It's all in the eyes. You know, vision is our life. Vision is the world. You know, vision is the whole movie. I mean, you're handicapped if you're blind, eh? You know, I don't want to hear from the handicapped, you know. But if you feel so disposed, I can handle it. Send it to Suzanne. Every year, billions of people go to holiday resorts. Isn't that a funny way to start? For the view. Well, it's true, no? Okay, this is basic human nature. If you take a first base and you put that first base in the ghetto somewhere in one of the horror zones of America, that's going to be very disturbing from deep, deep, deep down inside. Because with this whole need to see, it's also about where you are. And that those people that are flocking to those points at which they can have a view, those are people that live in environments in which there is no view at all. You know, the next door building or whatever the case may be. And it's so important for us to think about that. It's one of those things where sometimes it would be nice to be some kind of 15th century teacher, you know, and I could just drop a cookie on you and walk away, you know, instead of being what I am, which is a mechanic. But, you know, really understand what that means. How important it is for a human being to be able to look out over a vista. I mean, it's a simple thing. It seems like an innocuous thing when we look at humanity as a whole and we think we don't even deal with that. We don't even really comprehend what that's all about. There's something very important for us, you see, to stare off into space. It's one of the most beautiful things that the measuring being does. It just stares off into space. You know, it stares off into the whole. It gets lost in the vibration of the whole. So this need to look out and see things, this need to view, this need to be in a nice place. You know, I'm very privileged. I wake up in the morning, I look at the red rocks of Sedona through my window. It's a beautiful thing to see. I mean, I have the second gate first line. My direction in life is aesthetics. So to look out that and to see that is a beautiful thing. It's very, very important to grasp. It's very basic inside of us. And it says that we really do damage to the spirit and the psyche of humanity by turning our landscapes, by turning our environments into ugly things. We just do. And the more we limit the ability, the possibility for people to see something of beauty, to see nature, to be able to look out and to be able to integrate with nature, that we're actually doing something that is fundamentally unhealthy. Now, when I say that, by the way, it's not like I want to create an organization to fix that. There's no choice in all that. It's all about awareness, but it's about understanding how important that is. You have to be able to have that as a living thing. You need to be able to look out. It also means something else. It means that everybody that comes in at the first base, that means that they are the ones that determine what the location must be and where they should be. You see, all that measuring is in order to find your place. And you got all these astrophysicists trying to figure out where we fit in within the whole totality. And all this measurement is trying to find your place. Where do we fit in? That's the whole thing about differentiation. Remember this thing about uniqueness and different are not the same. You see, where you are, birds of a feather, we all like to flock together. It's the way that those things work in us. And of course, that where is all about seeing where you can fit in. In other words, where you can have a location, where you can have a place, where you can be separate, but you're not physically isolated. Because after all, part of the program is, by the time you get up to design level, the time you get up to your rave chart, you get up to a configuration that says, excuse me, the vast majority of you are generators. The vast majority of you are split definitions. You all need each other, and you can't avoid it because we have to have more children. So, it's not about you can ever get away from all of that. You can't. Those forces, those genetic forces are all around. They're pulling you in your separateness into, bonding, into being in communities, into being in the collective, all of those various things. However, you have to see that as a base for these people, this is specifically important. Not only that, but what we will find is that if you historically could go back and you could look at the people that planted a flag and said, this is going to be New Booga Booga or whatever, some name for some place, that one of the things that you'll find about these people is that these people are going to carry a first base. They're the ones that are going to be the migrators. They're the ones that are going to pick the locations. They're the ones that are going to establish where the settlements are going to be. In other words, in some ways, pathfinders in that sense. They're the active ones. They're the moving ones. They're the ones that won't be satisfied sitting by the fire in the valley month after month, year after year. There's something inside of them that wants to see what's on the other side. And it's not because they necessarily are curious about what's on the other side. They'd like to know where they are. That's the whole thing. I mean, if you take somebody and you fly them into this little port up here of Sedona, this little airport, and you blindfold them and you dump them down in the middle of Sedona, they don't know where the hell they are. They might be somewhere. But in order for them to know where they are, they're going to have to go out and measure all of that. They're going to have to go out and move through all of that and then come back to where they started from so that they then can understand where they are. I'm on this street in this place, blah, blah, blah. So this is the whole thing that is moving humanity. It's moving humanity over each and every single one of these boundaries. It's moving humanity through all of these processes, but it's saying that deep underneath, place is enormously important for these people. If you've got a first-base personality and you have an undefined self, you got a real blessing. If you've got an undefined self, you're going to be told analytically that place is the most important thing for you in your life, and that you have to wait for place to be initiated in your life. Now, of course, here's somebody with a first base where place is going to be very important. Location is going to be very important. If they don't know where they are, now remember something. I want you to see this, that it moves through various levels. I'm being very mundane when I'm talking about physical location because that's where it all begins. Remember, this is every form of life, not just human. Each creature needs to establish what its territory is. And every creature, it's like you bring a dog or a cat into your life. The first thing they're going to do is examine the territory. It's only natural. This is a whole thing about life because it's a way in which you begin the process of defending yourself and protecting yourself. You define the territory that is around you in order to be secure so you know where you are in that. But that's not just about the mundane. You see, we are a hierarchical structure, or are a part of a hierarchical structure. We are all in the hierarchy. All of us. All of us. We're all strung out level after level after level after level in this process in the hierarchy, and all of us are always trying to figure out where we are in that. Oh, does Jesus love me? Where are we in the hierarchy? This is the first base. It's the first base that says, okay, I'm moving, but where did I get to? So if you got the first base and you've joined the button-down corporation, you got all this activity and juice inside of you, but there's that part of you that's saying, all right, but where am I getting to? Okay, I've moved up this far. Maybe I can get to the next one. See, at the very, very base of what we are deeply, deeply competitive. Part of defining our uniqueness and seeing both our differences and our non-differences is that all leads to competitiveness. And it's not because we want to be competitive. Remember that at this level we have no access anyway. It's that life is competitive. That's what life is. Life is a competition. It's a competition against all natural forces. It's a competition against the resistance of ignorance. It's a competition against all of that. And if you don't win, you die, and you die sooner, and you die dumber. Now, there's nobody keeping score but you. And the score doesn't matter to anyone or anything. It's just you. Where am I? Is the question of the first base. Now that's close to Abbott and Costello. Where am I? You're on first. Where? Where's that? Where am I in my process? Where am I in my development? Where am I in my relationship? Where am I in my career? Where? All that measurement, all here, right from the beginning. When we were grouped together around the fire, the game was still going on. It's the oldest game in town. It's very, very difficult for me in my personal life to hold on to finding fault. There are moments I get annoyed, so those things last. But it's something that I recognize that is one of the great and most difficult steps for any human being in finding grace in this life. Once you get to the point that you can really understand the mechanical helplessness of all of us, the first base personality operating out of the not self and operating without awareness can be very obnoxious. It can be a part of an aggressive way of life and a dog-eat-dog world and a way of looking at humanity and a way of looking at others and a way of creating environments that end up being detrimental to others. And that in the end is unhealthy for the very beings that are generating all of that. But that comes out of a lack of awareness. It's not about fault. This is a beautiful energy after all. All of these bases are beautiful. How can they be anything else? And it's perfect within itself. It's not about us bringing our prejudices to these things and saying, oh, this is no good and that, blah, it's all crap. But it's also being able to recognize that the real truth of your intellectual understanding is your acceptance of that in your life as you meet it. Because of course you're going to meet this. Not only that, you will have aspects in your design activations that you have in certain gates. If you're not a first base personality, you're going to have at least one or two of them in your design. You're going to have a part of you that's attuned to that energy. Otherwise, you couldn't be alive in this Maya. It's there. And it's about seeing that we need to get to a point of acceptance that the only thing that we can say to somebody is that, you might benefit from living out your type. Because it's not about fault. It's not about anything. It's about seeing that this is energy and how it works. So these people that are very fixed on where they are and very fixed on maintaining the hierarchy, remember, we need that. We need that. Nobody is going to get my place in the hierarchy because nobody else has that place in the hierarchy. Because that's just the way that it works. It's not about choice. It isn't about anything else. It's always like that for all of us. And the moment that we accept that we have a place in the role, for me, you must understand my own joke with the hierarchy. The voice told me I was its dog. So that's my relationship in the hierarchy to the voice, At that level, I'm just a good dog. I wag my tail. I'm very obedient. I know my place in the hierarchy, so it's not like I'm saying, whoa, up here. It's not about that. First of all, I'm not a first base, so I don't measure. But it's about understanding that the hierarchy is an essential ingredient in life because it's the way in which the information moves. And you see, the more sophisticated we become in the exchange of information, and again, that's the byproduct of the first base, all that activity, all that intellectual work, all that defining, we get to a point in which you can diffuse information at vast speeds. It's an extraordinary thing. And of course, this is what the first base is all involved with. But it all has to operate through the hierarchies. Now, the real evolution is to see that the lowest end of the scale, the lowest end of the hierarchical scale on the mundane plane on this planet is doing better, generally speaking, than ever before. But the fact is that 50% of the planet, has finally gotten to benefit from our place in civilization, and to remember that if you go back only about 150 years, only about 1% of the world population had the same benefits that about half of the world population have today. In other words, there has been a enrichment and education process that's taken place that has never before happened on this planet. And of course, that's the glory of the first base. What happens is that they have their difficulty when there's no place to go. You see, the whole thing about the yang is that the yang first base is penetrating out into the world to measure, to see the territory, to recognize its place, to find its position. Its difficulty only comes when all of that's established. After all, what are scientists? They're a bunch of wacko first base searchers. Busy. Gotta find it. That's all first base stuff. When you find it, what do you do? What do you do? It's like all of these uptight businessmen who work for 50 years, retire, and drop dead in a week. What are you going to do? And of course, that ultimately is the crisis for this first facet, this first base. And they won't experience, by the way, that crisis until the transition takes place in the form itself. So it's a rather mystical conversation anyway. Nonetheless, it's important to see that there is a limitation in all of that. There's a limitation in all of that because the very definition of life can be mutated. The very definition of life can be mutated. Remember, life is relative to us. It's what we call life, after all. We make that up. We give life its name. Now, that doesn't mean that we understand how life works. That just means that we identify aspects of life, give them names, and define them. What I know is that what we call life, that ultimately life is going to be mutated. Life is going to have a different kind of definition. That different kind of definition isn't going to be dependent on multiplication. It isn't going to be dependent on population expansion, of growth, of diversity. It isn't going to operate mutatively in that way. It isn't going to operate through, warm, sentient bodies. So life can mutate. So that's when this first base will have to, have a change in the way in which it operates through the whole. So these last components here, where, seeing, location, these are the dominant themes. And so what's going to happen in the future is that we can get to a place where when we see somebody come in on the first base, one of the things that we're going to be very concerned about is what kind of an environment are they coming into? I've had enough children, so I've had enough experience with all kinds of fads in childbirthing. The water methods, the dark room music methods, all of these, the stand up in the field methods, all of these various things. And one of the things that's interesting is that a first base child would benefit from, coming into a pleasant environment, coming into, for example, a home birth, or coming into an environment that's more soothing than would, traditionally be expected in a hospital, or those kinds of things. In other words, that from the very start, location for them is going to be very important. They will remember all of their life. And not conscious remember, just deep in the crystal awareness remembrance. They will remember all their life that they started off in a ugly room. Location, place, where they are is going to be very important for them. It also means that a first-base person is always going to need confirmation or affirmation of their process and progress. In America alone, at least according to my telephone calls, there must be 40 million salespeople. Eh? I mean, something like that. And I know because in early on in my life, one of the many things that I did was that I trained salespeople. It's an interesting psychological thing. And if you imagine all these millions and millions of salespeople out there, all pitching, and what they're really interested in is not how much money they make. What they're interested in is whether they got more sales than the asshole in the cubbyhole next to them. And what they like best of all is at the end of the week or at the end of the month, all the results get posted on a board and everybody sees their place in the hierarchy. And that's as close as you get to being hunter-gatherers. It's as close as you get to being able to bring the thing in on your shoulder and lay it down and say, see what I'm doing for the community? And they're all living out that. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're all being busy, being in the hierarchy, being competitive with each other. And it's very important to them whether they're the salesman of the year or not. I once had a job when I was 19 years old, working for an insurance company, British Columbia. And my job was to go see young lumbermen, guys working in the forest, cutting down trees. Very dangerous business. And I had a routine. And the routine is that I would go into their house, and there was always young couples. They were always several years older than me. I was very young to be doing that. And they were skeptical also. And I would go in, and it would always be in their kitchen. I love this stuff, eh? And I would go down and I would sit down in the kitchen and I wouldn't say a word. Nothing. They get very uncomfortable. They slowly get antsy. And the whole time I'm looking at her. The whole time I'm looking at her. And I can feel, I did it so many times. Eh? I know this energy from men. Eh? It's such a funny energy. And you can feel that they're it's all this tribal male. So I would just look at her, and then, when I felt that there was enough tension, I would turn to the guy and I would say, do you want somebody to have to look after her if you die? And he'd say, how much is this? So I would go back into the office, and I'd go back into the office, and of course, at the end of, weeks or months, whatever, I was very good at that, and they would put me up on this hierarchy. I know the hierarchy really well. And they would put me up on this hierarchy, and they would blah, 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 and all of this stuff. And the guys below would bitch and scream, and, it's not fair. It's the way human beings are. It's the way they are. See, one of the things I like about my life, I've done a lot of things. And I know what the world and how the world operates, and all of those things are real. They're in all of us. And you could see the whole nature of what it is to be an animal, the competitiveness, all of that stuff, how important it was for people, whether they were first on the list or second on the list or third on the list. I mean, in America, you produce more lists than any country on earth. I mean, this is the country of lists. You have books of lists that you put out. I mean, it's endless. I got an 8-year-old kid. He brings them home. I end up in the middle of the day getting questions like, how many birds don't fly? I don't care. He's got some crazy list. Who's the tallest American president? I don't care. I mean, if you're a baseball fan, you can spend your whole life addicted to statistics. I mean, you can find out how many times a left-handed pitcher, hit a right-handed pitcher on a Wednesday night game, in the month of October. And they'll tell you hierarchies, lists. It's all here in the first base, and it's all part of life. People always talk about the Holocaust, but there's only one thing that makes the Holocaust a horror. Only one thing. Everything was listed. Everything. Everything was listed. I mean, the Japanese didn't do that in China. The Russians didn't do that in the Ukraine. I mean, can you imagine a Russian saying, geez, I better make a list of the dead? It would be absurd. The horrors, the list. Endless lists of information, lists. First base. It's what it's all about. If you go into that deep enough, there are some incredible things in there. See, that's us. It's all this measuring. It's all this putting on lists. It's how many supporters do you have? How much money did you raise last week, Al Gore? It's all about lists. It's all about the hierarchy. It's all about where you are. That's the foundation of life, not human life. It's not about us getting into this vanity trip that says we distort all this. That's the most vulgar vanity of all for me, is people who keep on accusing humanity of destroying the earth. I mean, the vanity of that is unbelievable. We don't have any choice in that, and no human being on this planet is wise enough to understand what all this means and why all of this works the way it does. And that the nature of pollution, or the nature of this, or the nature of that, what the long-term impact is on the development of our species and the way things work, nobody knows. This whole business about being negative about all these things, the vanity of thinking how important we are. This is about life itself. All life is like this. All life is interested in where they are. All life is there, being interested in where they are, responding to the light. That's life. All life is unique. All life is competitive. All life. I used to love it in Ibiza. Every once in a while, they'd have a make-work project. And that would mean that a dirt road would get paved, sort of. And the interesting thing about that is that what they would do is that they would spray the dirt, and they would lay down some gravel, and then they'd spray a kind of asphalt oil over that and leave it. And for the first 3 weeks, it looked like a road. And then something incredible would happen. You'd start watching life eat that road up. And one day you drive onto that road, and all of a sudden there's a plant that's pushed its way up through all of this stuff. And if you leave that road for 5 years, they take it back. It's gone. There is a tenacious competitiveness in all of life That's why if you're not living out who you are, life is so uncomfortable. It's not about the mundane application of what competitiveness means. It's about understanding that all life is struggling to be life. And that you take all the pressure off and you eliminate all the resistance the moment that you're living mechanically correctly within yourself. You honor your type. You honor what is your nature. You honor your authority. You'll see that's very different. But this stuff, there's nothing we can do about that. That's part of what it is to be alive, and it's important for us to accept that. And it's important for us to see that there are forces in this life who have to live that out at every level in the spectrum. And they will. Making all the lists, figuring out all the hierarchies, doing all of that, ultimately selfishly, so that they can know their place. And it's the first thing for us to be able to do. From the very beginning, when we looked at the sky, we started this process of saying, where the hell are we? Where is this? What is this? Where am I? We were on the backs of turtles and, where am I? It's what it's all about from the very beginning. Find your place, secure your territory. Be able to see those that are familiar to you. And to keep on making your list until you list everything. And when you've got everything listed, then you can retire.